Women were encouraged to can extra preserves and send them off to the troops, but also a lot of women stepped up to take over the local businesses and the responsibilities of farming because there were no men, or many fewer men, to look after these responsibilities. Now, Mona was part of Campfire Girls, and their job was knitting outfits for Belgian babies. Now, if you remember the story of Edith Cavell, or Cavell, as a lot of people know her, but it's Edith Cavell. Edith Cavell in 1915, around the time this picture was taken, was arrested. She was an English nurse working in Belgium and became part, inadvertently actually, became part of a resistance network. And Edith Cavell was captured, she was tried, along with a couple of other nurses, and she was sentenced to die. Now, at the time, nobody thought that they would execute a woman. And there was a lot of stuff going back and forth, but because the British really didn't think they would do this, I don't think they put in the effort that they would if it had been a man. So they downplayed it, didn't want to annoy the Germans, and in October 1915, Edith Cavell died before a firing squad. It made headlines around the world. People were outraged. Mona, 15 years old, very impressed by the story of Edith Cavell, and I'm wondering how much that woman's story of courage under duress actually, first of all, influenced her as a 15-year-old girl, and certainly was in the back of her mind when she began to have her own trouble with the Nazis later on. Now, some of these, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but again, I love these family grouping. You know, Norval on this end, her dad with the pipe, Mona with the check coat, her mom, her brother Gwyn, and I don't know who this guy is, but he looks an awful lot like her father, so I'm going to assume it's an uncle or some close relative. This was on an outing that they did to Annapolis Royal, and checking out the Powder magazine, post-family shot, and out in front of the building at St. Anne. I don't know who the other guy, this other fellow, I thought, how did George Bernard Shaw get in? It wouldn't surprise me if she knew him. But you can tell by a lot of these photographs the closeness that Mona had with her dad. There's, this is her out on the dikes snowshoeing. And this is a family shot. Now, you see Mona and her dad, her arm interlinked with his, and one woman over is her mom, so her mother's fourth in. And the detail, I took a detail of this photo, but that pretty much sums up the relationship, the love that Mona had for her dad. And what was most poignant was after the war, long after Harry Foster had died, and Mona was back here living in Wolfville and dealing with her own mental health problems because of, she was trying to understand what was happening to her because she was having TIAs, transient ischemic attacks, mini strokes. But like most of us, I guess, we may get older, but for us, our parents are always somehow there. And Mona would even buy, there's one Christmas card that she bought for him in 1961 and said, "This is the card I would have sent to my father were he still alive." It was a loss that she felt for the rest of her life. So that's the reason I include this picture. Now, we talked about Vincent White. I just included this. This is the Acadia Dramatic Fraternity program, 1928. Now, by this point, Mona had graduated from the Acadia Ladies Seminary, where it was their duty to educate young, genteel Christian women in deportment and elocution so that they could be a suitable wife to a suitable man, right? And so the desire of most women was to marry well. Some might have a career as a teacher or a secretary, but it really wasn't supposed to be something you were going to do for life. It was something you did until the right man came along. Now, Mona was not quite like her colleagues or her peers in that respect because she wanted something more out of life. She wanted to be an actor. Now, she wanted to be an actor on the serious stage, in part because of the influence of a woman, Dean of Women, McLean. And I can't remember her first name, isn't that terrible? But she was Dean of Women here until 1943. In the 1920s, she was responsible for bringing an awful lot of the plays that were being produced in New York, like Shaw, like O'Neill, serious plays. And now Mona was quite familiar with opera and Victorian melodrama and light comedy, that sort of thing, but she really sunk her teeth into this. Now Maclean's children also were at Acadia, and Kathleen Maclean, who actually is, she's on the technical side for this play. You'll see a couple of Macleans. There's Virginia, William. These were the Dean of Women's children. And Kathleen Maclean, who was a friend of Mona's, went on to study elocution, to study theater, but she lived in Toronto for a while, then she went down to Virginia where she married Ira Beatty, and of course they went on to have two children, Shirley Maclean and Warren Beatty. So, the influence is very strong here. I have this to show you that Vincent White and Mona Parsons acted in at least one play, probably more, but this is the only one I can find in the Acadia archives. So this is 1928. By the time they were producing this play, or they were in this play together, Mona had already gone to New York. She had gone to Boston to study elocution at the Curry School of Expression, which was a world-renowned school. Many people, it wasn't just people who were looking to go into theater, a lot of clergymen, lawyers, future politicians, because they were mastering the art of public speaking. Now, Mona left that and got a job in Arkansas. She was teaching elocution at a school in Arkansas. And she did a little bit of traveling. I have just recently, thanks to Ancestry.ca, yay, found some customs documents to show that she entered and left the country quite frequently. She went down to Bermuda to stay with family friends for several months. So again, she was not having to work. She was something of a woman of leisure. But she did come back to Acadia and did do a little bit of studying. And this play, 1928, before she went off to make it big, and went and auditioned for the Ziegfeld Follies. Now, depending on which story you heard, Mona sometimes said, I just auditioned for a touring company with the Ziegfeld Follies. But my favorite story was she was in a restaurant and Flo Ziegfeld, the producer of the biggest music theater revue in the world in the 20th century, was dining at a table. Mona, being the kind of person that she was, walked up and said, hello. Now, he had a reputation for appreciating a pretty face and a nicely turned ankle, and she said, I'd like to audition for your show, and he went, done. Now, however it turned out, she did work for a while, but it was not the serious theater that she wanted to be in. She was, when you think at this point she's 29, she's coming up to 30 years of age. Man, that is old for a showgirl in the 1920s. When you've got some of the silent film stars were 16 when they made it big. So she was realizing that if it's not going to happen soon, it's not going to happen at all. So with that in mind, she looked at her other options, but before she could do that, she was called back to Wolfville because her mother had had a stroke. Now, Mona was back for a few weeks before her mother, by the time she got here, her father had hired a nurse whose name was Alma Cummings. Her mother was not very well. She survived for a little while, but died just around the time of Mona's birthday. So at this point, as must happen when you lose a parent very suddenly at that kind of age, 30 years of age, she had to think about what she was going to do next. Am I going to go back to, we've already had the stock market crash. So most of the high rollers that she'd been dating were no longer rolling. Right? And she was no longer content just to dangle off somebody's arm. This was a woman with ability and talent. She just didn't know exactly what it was yet, or how to make it known to the world. But in her mother's death and having the support of Alma Cummings, she began to realize that there was a path for her, and it was nursing. And I also think Edith Cavell, in the back of her mind, was an influence. So she went back to the States. She went to Jersey School of Medicine in Jersey City. And she graduated a couple of years later, cum laude, with her nursing degree. Now, Mona has that kind of special charm. She got a job with a Park Avenue ear, nose, and throat specialist named Ross Faulkner, who was from Nova Scotia. Doubtless there was some kind of connection there. And so this is where she ended up. I mean, in the 1930s, in the midst of the Depression, she ends up working on Park Avenue, living at a nice address, as an independent career woman, not having to rely on anybody. Now she's ready to meet Mr. Right on her terms.